I don't know if
It
you saw
happened.
this. This is fairly new, Alex O'Connor, which eventually you'll be able to debate this guy. It'll be beautiful. Or this other guy, too. I mean, he's got a decent channel. Unsolicited Advice, his channel is. They're talking about answers atheists can't answer. If you missed it, why is there something rather than nothing we covered? Why question in general. Ought is we covered. The ought is gap. I
They
skipped the
touched on that, or
Calvinist.
you covered it?
I covered this video. I'm going through their chapters of what they list as the argument, the questions that the atheists can't answer.
Right. Did they cover is ought?
They did, yeah.
Oh,
They essentially said, well, the Christian can't answer the is ought problem either, and so you're in the same problem. And I brought up, well, there's a different question. Why ought we be consistent with, let's say, is ought fallacies or following fallacies? why ought we pursue true things or consistent beliefs at all is a bigger question that's not listed in this video. And that's a question that if they can't answer that, the rest of the things that they list are kind of useless anyway, right? So, I just wish I wrote the questions for their video. What would you write as a question? What's something you would ask an atheist you don't think they can answer if it's not listed here?
well, I haven't seen the list, but I would just say stuff like, how are there laws when a law cannot be identified with any set of atoms? And if they say something like, or molecules, well, it's a recognition of a pattern. To call something a pattern assumes what is in question, which is what's the unifying thing between these particular instances. And they can never get anything more. If it's all just molecules, well, there's not actually any similarity between these things, unless you want to say because they're all molecules, which doesn't actually tell us any pattern because everything's molecules. So really there would be no pattern. And this, I think, derives from the fact, as you're probably figuring out as you go through this video, which I haven't seen, but I'm assuming, because all atheists do this, just simply that, look, atheism has to essentially reject metaphysics for the most part.
Yep.
And then at the same time, pretend that they have some kind of common sense, simple way to account for the metaphysics and the principles that they're denying. And that's always what happens.
Right. Yeah. So an atheist view, which ultimately almost every time reduces to physicalism or naturalism, they're engaging with a bunch of, in their worldview, particulars that don't have a unifying principle or law to them. They're all just particulars. And that because they occur as they work together, that's enough for them to just grant themselves some sort of uniformity. But the particulars themselves don't give them the uniformity.
And what is the law? Exactly. And usually when you drill into it, it just ends up being a circle. They just restate that it's the things that are similar. What are the things that are similar? The patterns that are alike. It's just like they can never really give you anything substantial, because once they admit metaphysical principles, they're in an even deeper dilemma, because they have to then try to give an account for something that most of the time their position out of hand rejects.
Dude, every time to me, it always goes to Allah's foot. It's every single time where you're like, well, what are you referring to that's similar to this other thing? He's trying right now, this guy, by the way, Jay, he's saying that, well, the laws of thought are just consistent descriptions with how we see the physical world, which obviously is appealing to the thing in question, because in order to engage with it. Go ahead. Yeah.
So they're descriptions of the actual physical world, or the way we see the physical world? Because those are two different things in the history of empiricism.
Yeah. So there's the things in the world, and then they just grant themselves, well, their interpretation of the things in the world are self-evident, but that's not true, is it? No. So also the uniformity of how people interpret things in the world has this coherency. It's not identical. We misfire, we get some things wrong, but there's a general unity between mind concepts in the material world, and those are particular things under the atheists that they can't even justify, but let alone that they work together. That's two different things.
Correct. And then there's another layer too, which is often missed, because a lot of people don't do anything with linguistic philosophy, And I'm not a linguistic philosophy expert, but I had enough of it to notice some of the big flaws or the big holes in the atheist position, which is that if you get into the nitty gritty of linguistic philosophy, you start to realize there's a difference between a proposition, like the truth value of the proposition and what it's referring to. So to say that nature operates in a law-like fashion, there's a truth value there that's assumed. That's not reducible to or identical to the symbols on the page or the words coming out of your mouth or the breath coming out of your mouth or the things themselves. So you see that there's different layers going on, and almost always because of their stupidity, their reductionism, their lack of knowledge of philosophy, they always collapse everything. So if you were to actually start to distinguish these things, they really would kind of they become deer in the headlights because they've never thought about distinguishing those things. The proposition itself, the truth value of the proposition, which is in some way a universal, and the things themselves, the referent.
Yeah, and by the way, I've argued that when I argued that from the physicalist atheist view that that laws, evaluations and propositions, if they're reduced to material, end up just being effects of previous mechanical physics. But I granted them too much in that video because I use laws of physics. That's already a whole category that's in question that I shouldn't grant them. So instead I got it reduced to, well, for the knowledge to be possible under the atheist physicalist view is that you have to have a meaningful distinction between a referent and a reference. And what's fascinating about their view is that every new reference that they grant themselves under their own view is just a new event in time, which means it's a referent now. So it's like a percolation from the brain. Some weird epiphenomenal thing happens, a brain fart. And they call that the evaluation or the proposition about the other thing that's physical, right? Oh, this other thing called a tree or my thoughts. Well, no. Now you're stuck with a thing called a referent, which is another event that you need an evaluator for.
Well,
it's all,
that,
all the way down.
Meaning inheres over in the mind over time. So in other words, not just identity over time in terms of objects, but if they predicate meaning of some object or some subject or whatever, the idea is that there's the same meaning that's going on in my head is actually matching up over time to the objects in the world which have identity over time. So the more you dissect this, the more it really is resting on all kinds of things that they just never even thought of, and most of the time they don't know what you're asking when you're asking these questions.
I'm trying to find ways to draw this in not a huge insult, but it's just kind of funny, like in basically whiteboard crayon stuff to show physically what I mean, because you know why? Because if you defend physicalism, you really do have to, whiteboard, you really have to tell me the difference between a bunch of molecules you call a waterfall or bubbling or a tree, and the molecules you call in the brain called thinking and evaluating. And the difference between those, you're going to have to tell me physically the difference between the two such that one has the capacity to be truth-apt and the other is just an object in space. They never quite understand what I'm asking, so I'm trying to get better at just doodling and maybe put it up on a board. The whiteboard wins every time, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if I write this out, this proposition, nature is law-like. This is a series of symbols on a board that refers to what thing? I mean, it's not obviously referring to any specific particulars in nature. It's referring to this supposedly universal pattern. And to make it universal, we'll add all nature because they typically do make universal quantifier claims. All nature is law-like. Okay, what's the truth? They are assuming that this is a true proposition and not a false proposition. So the truth value is not identical to the symbols themselves, right? And the phrase is referring to something other than either just the truth value or the particular instances. So in other words, we've got all of these layers of stuff with absolutely no explanation. And that's just the sentence itself. Yeah. What about the things going on in my head, which I'm assuming are conveying meaning about the external world over time? That meaning stays the same in terms of the identity of objects out there over time and the meaning in my head over time. Because remember, I'm just chemical reactions firing. What if the meaning that I thought yesterday for all nature is law-like has completely fired to be the opposite meaning today?
Right.
I mean, it's just, and not just the meaning of the phrase. What about these individual words themselves? You can break this down into individuals, right?
Right.
What is all nature? I mean, just at any point, if you think about it linguistically, and I'm not telling you what they were saying.
Sure.
I'm just saying, like, nobody really goes after the atheists on this, not because of anybody being stupid on our side, but just people just don't even realize how much goes into, like, to be able to make a sentence meaningful requires a certain kind of world.
Yeah, and it's crazy. It's a crazy world if you're going to try to explain it in just particulars that are unrelated. It can't. Well, you can't explain it.
Chaotic molecules firing of unrelated particulars.
Yeah. Also, that brings up the law thing in general. Even if you said granted them the statement nature is law, like, I always like to put it like, okay, objects exist, right? Forget about how you're going to justify how objects exist and what their beginnings are. Stuff comes from stuff is an argument I've been debunking the last couple of months. The stuff, even the collection of the stuff, let alone the particular stuffs that you're listing, they don't give you the justification for how they behave with each other. Those are two different things, but they grant them they're the same. Well, no, we have a tree. And because we have a tree, we're just throw into the basket, it operates a certain way, right? By nature of it just being a tree. But you're like, well, no, these things are all working together. It's not like the object existing gives you how the relationships physically, causal relationships and behaviors that you observe. That's not the same thing. But they're like, no, it is the same thing because that's how we observe it. Well, no, that's not. You're just granting yourself a bunch. But let me move on. You tell me, Jay, when to stop. We're going to listen to this guy. He's currently trying to argue if we observe the world a different way, we can just change the laws of logic to suit that world. I don't know if you heard my refutation of this, that if you said I observe the world a certain way, and if I observed it a certain way such that I can conventionally change the laws of thought, you're actually using one standard of the laws of thought to perceive the world a certain way and trusting that is true in order to come to some conventional alteration to what you perceived, right? To fit it. Well, this conventional view of changing the law of identity, so long as it fits whatever you're observing, assumes the law of identity, doesn't it? Like, you can't change the thing you're ultimately using to discern what's going on. It makes no sense to go back.
Well, yeah, I mean, then they're no longer laws. They would have a different. I mean, if they could be otherwise, they're not laws.
Right. Yeah, and you're appealing to something you're calling law, like to observe it, and then going, well, I'm going to change it. Well, no, you're trusting the thing you observed to begin with. That doesn't make sense. Anyway, let him ramble on.
And that strikes me as a sensible question, right? And often, and kind of the only answer that somebody who suggests that who's doing the human direction, the metaphysical human direction explanation there, is to say something like, well, if the world had been different, then the laws of logic would have been different, and we would have made different laws of logic. And like,
let me see if he pushes back on that.
I can kind of get. I sort of I go back and forth on this intuitively, where sometimes I find this like incredibly unsatisfying, and sometimes I'm like, okay, maybe there's something in this, because we do things like reason with uncertainty, because we have probability for reasoning with uncertainty. If we were never uncertain about anything, we wouldn't have had probability. There would be no need for it. Likewise, if deduction was always uncertain for whatever reason, like that was just empirically true in the world, as weird as that is to say, then our deductions would have uncertainty attached to them and stuff like that. So there's an argument that you can say there, but then we're also at this point.
He's also conflating right now the methods we use to do induction or deduction being certain, induction being probabilistic, are identical to the laws that we use to do those things. The question isn't the methods you use, but rather the laws that govern the methods of reasoning. And I don't know why they always collapse these two. It's like the laws of thought are not identical to the descriptions of them. Like, there's a law of identity that exists in some way, right? That's not identical to our ability to describe that in a 3-statement bullet point, right?
Yeah, I mean, the first phrase that I'm still trying to think through that he said that I think was wrong is that we made these laws.
Right.
The fact
We
that
made the laws.
they're discoveries, they're not creations. So because atheists don't believe in, divine truth or the divine mind, they assume that all this stuff has to be some sort of human social construct or some individual that made them or created them. So even though Aristotle might be the source of the classical laws or whatever, we would say he's discovering something. And even mathematicians nowadays will say that a lot of the things that they've discovered, like Mandelbrot sets, it's impossible for those to be made up by the human mind.
Yeah. Also, something really obvious here is that to say someone created something is to assume the law of identity before you're creating the law of identity. Like, this is why it's fun when I talk to these people when they assume axioms. They're like, we developed the laws of thought, the 3 classical laws, as axioms. And I say, how do you develop something without using the thing that you're saying you're developing? It's impossible, right? So it's like,
it's kind of stupid. Like if they actually think that it didn't exist before that. So in other words, 2 rocks and 2 rocks wasn't 4 rocks until somebody decided that it was 4 rocks.
Right. Yeah. As opposed to if you discover the laws of thought, the math of 2 plus 2 is derivative of the laws of logic, and that 2, right, is under some sort of discovery and not from a creation. You don't create. It's not created.
Yeah,
it's discovered.
There's an eternal truth that humans have the ability to discover,
as opposed to invent. And if it's invented, there's no discovering. Yeah. If you're creating the truth, you could just create a not a truth tomorrow, and it wouldn't have any problems. So the pursuit of truth.
So in other words, you could just make it absurd and say, so until Aristotle listed the law of identity, nothing had identity.
Nothing had identity. Yeah. Even him, even Aristotle. There was no him. Yeah.
Bumping up against something we talked about at the beginning of the episode, which is what is the limits of possibility? Yes. Is it in some sense impossible for the laws of logic to have been different? Because
by the laws of logic, what are we talking about?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point as well, because the laws of logic are themselves kind of controversial. So classically, things like a few uncontroversial laws, well, as uncontroversial as anything.
Well, I mean, by the way, the fact that something's controversial, I'm guessing they're going to probably get into
fuzzy logic or something.
Well, the fallacy of incredulity, like when you were talking about his account of saying that Christians, they don't have an answer to is ought. When I'm thinking, I didn't hear what they said, but I'm guessing it was probably that they don't understand or consider it to be a sufficient answer, right? When a Christian says that God is the reasoning for, and they would probably say something like, well, I find that hard to believe. I don't see how that's a good answer. And so, the fact that even the laws of logic are controversial, that has nothing to do with whether they're necessary for predication.
Right. Yeah. Whether they're not controversial or controversial, is irrelevant to.
It's like when people say, well, Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox disagree over the church of the first 1,000 years, so we can't know. Well, the fact that people disagree is irrelevant to whether it's true or false.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, that seems to be a good safeguard from coming to any certain conclusion about it, which is all they've done so far. They haven't really said, no, we can answer that question. They're kind of being, I would even say, humble in their responses so far.
A implies B, then
dumb, but
from
it's
A
humble.
to B, stuff like that. One of the less controversial ones is the law of non-contradiction. So you not A and not A. So if you have A, you can infer not A.
So something can't be true and false at the same time.
Yeah, basically. I mean, it's very intuitive, right? But there are people that
you say not as in it's true that not brackets A and not A.
So I mean, I don't know.
Now another thing, Jay, I know you covered this, but if you're just purely relying on science and induction, and you believe that everything's in flux, then there is no maintained identity of A at the molecular or the larger scale of the thing you're referring to. So they believe in flying spaghetti monsters called laws of logic. Right, totally. And it's always change. If it's in flux, then the thing you're constantly referring to make statements, when they say, well, A can't be not A, and this is a law. Well, if the thing you're referring to out in the world is always changing, you could actually say that there was only one instance that's tiny in a fraction of time where something existed as purely itself, and everything else is some weird changed version of that, even at the molecular level. They would have to argue that, and even them granting themselves induction, to do inductive reasoning is the assumption that that's not the case, that things are always in flux at every level. But yet, some of them argue that that's what they've come to a conclusion as. A conclusion doing their reasoning is that everything's in flux, and you're like, including your reasoning. And this is an old one that even Bonson, I guess, would have popularized maybe before that. Is that He's just saying, well, no, the flux position of rationality in molecules in motion, you're referring to something that no longer existed as itself, called the molecules in a particular pattern. So what the hell is it you're trusting right now?
Yeah, and you couldn't even identify molecules without the law of identity.
Right.
Make like a little icon pop up on the screen.
We're getting a hard no from our video guy.
So not A and not A, and close bracket. And there are also more controversial logical laws, like the law of the excluded middle, which is, oh god, I always get this. Actually, no, let's just say
something can only be true or false. Only be true or false.
There are two really similar laws here. So one is the law of the excluded middle, and one is bivalence. And for some reason, I always get them the wrong way around, and I got completely roasted by a supervisor.
Well, what's the difference?
Well, so the law of the excluded middle is something is either A or not A. The law of bivalence is any statement is either true or false. And they're clearly connected, but they are different in the way. Well, they're distinct in the way that logicians care about.
I may have been misusing that too. I'm not.
But I mean, I misuse it all the time, and I'm meant to know about this.
It's like I always say, whatever, man.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Jay, would you say the three classical laws are distinct from each other on their own, or are they entailments of each other and you don't know where the starting point is necessarily? Like is one the entailment
they all
of
kind
the
of necessitate each other. There's not really a starting point.
Gotcha.
So here are some examples of the kinds of laws that we're talking about, right? These kinds of like fundamental... seemingly self-justifying, intuitive, like bases for working with thought. I mean, like if A implies B, that is like if A then B, A, therefore B. Well, how do you know that? It just seems like you're kind of saying the same thing twice.
Yeah,
it just has to be true.
Yes, like what if you don't have this? What do you have? Yeah. So one of the quirks of classical logic is that you can and a contradiction implies anything. And,
So if the atheist says, well, we accept logic whether we call it axiomatic or not, we can't not accept it because it's a contradiction to attempt to reject it. Now, is that sufficient in just one level of argumentation? No. Can you talk on that quick?
Yeah, there's a great section on this in the Russ Mannion paper where he covers this because you might think that just pointing out that we absolutely have to have logic might make it a justification. But as Mannion points out in the paper, just saying that it appears to be necessary for predication doesn't mean that it's the case. It also doesn't tell me that my mental schema of what's necessary for me to have predication necessarily applies to anything in the world. So that's why you need more for the justification of these things than just the idea that, well, it appears to be irrational to deny them. Because a lot of times, if you, for example, the first argument I had with Tim Gordon in DMs 4 years ago was I mentioned this point, and he said, well, you're just talking about retorsion, which is Aristotle's reductio. Aristotle says if you disagree with the classical laws of logic or the three, law of identity, you are not just assuming it to use it, but there's a reductio here that without it, logic would be impossible. So that's true, and it's correct to say that. But as the Mannion paper shows, post Kant, remember people at Aristotle's time, they didn't think the way Kant and Hume did. After Kant, other questions get raised that show that you need more for epistemic justification than just saying that it appears to be crazy otherwise. You need a stronger case, which is why you have to also argue that there are all these other sort of transcendental categories. In other words, you need a worldview that goes along with these things. You can't just have these as self-evident starting principles, because again, That might be a little. Am I getting?
No. I understand. It sounds like, just to translate here, is that pointing to the necessary existence of one thing isn't sufficient, because there's a whole slew of other things that need to be the case all together as one thing.
Right. Yes.
For that to operate. So, for instance, if I come to the conclusion of rejecting the law of identity is absurd, therefore I shouldn't do it, or like Christopher Hitchens was like, well, people ask me if I have free will, and I say I don't have a choice otherwise, right? Yeah, this kind of thing.
That doesn't give you the justification for the principle itself.
Gotcha. Yeah, because there's just one isolated instance that you're referring to. Even if you granted, okay, fine, it's absurd to reject it. To reject something assumes the mind. And now you have another thing that is absurd to reject. Yes. And now how many things can you put in the basket that are absurd to reject? Well, we would correct me if I'm wrong, the things that are absurd to reject, for anyone to reject, as a folder, a giant folder called the transcendental category itself, the whole list of things we can point to. The only meaningful question would be, whose worldview accounts for those things altogether holistically, correct?
Yeah, and
all of it together.
I think that's true, but if I remember in the Mannion paper, he just makes an even more simpler, basic reply, which is like he uses the Kantian argument that, okay, so let's say for the sake of argument that it is seemingly absurd to deny the law of identity, and so therefore I need the law of identity. And so let's grant that. But that doesn't tell me that the law of identity, which I think is going on in my mental schema, actually applies to anything in the world.
Yeah.
So, in other words, what about the external world and all that? You haven't solved that stuff yet. And so just on that basis alone, it shows that it can't be self-evident, and retorsion is not enough for justification. Because then he goes on to say, well, maybe the laws of logic are conceptual schemes that we all think work and we think they apply to the world, but they don't, in fact.
Yeah, we just thinking them is pragmatic enough that we just do that. Then it's pragmatism. It's like, oh, we do
exactly.
We assume truth in this because so we can do stuff, right? Like that's
no. So it's like it's a pragmatic turn, and that's not enough for justification. And by that logic, anything that seems to work would therefore be justified.
Right. Okay, so let me ask, and again, you don't need to go into super detail, but maybe if there was a key distinction here, what if an atheist said, he made a lot of sense right there with these individual things that you can argue the absurdity of the conclusion, what was it called? Sorry, the absurdity of the contrary, like to deny these things. If they agreed with you and said, okay, so if arguing something by necessity doesn't really fully justify it, but you can accept the argument that to reject something and use it is silly, so you shouldn't do that. What if they put that to you and they say, well, Jay, if the argument for God from the transcendental argument is of necessity, what's the classification difference between this unique item called using logic and rejecting logic uses logic? What's the difference now if they're going to say, well, shit, dude, you're saying argument for necessity right now that you just said that's not true just because it's necessitated?
Yeah, that's why I always argue that you can't just do the negative critique when you do tag. You also have to present the positive case of the Christian worldview. So the first critique is Kantian. And if we were Kantians, we would have to admit, like the Barry Stroud paper says, that there's a problem in Kant's arguments that don't necessarily prove what he wants to argue for. So remember in the first case of why, say the law of identity, the reason that doesn't get you to justification is because I can just simply counter with Kant's critique and say, well, just because it seems to me that it's necessary mentally and psychologically to understand the world does not tell me that that's a real metaphysical principle in the world.
I got you.
And maybe it is, but how does just it seeming and my coherence in my mind necessarily entail that the whole world externally to me is operating that way? That's a sufficient enough objection to show that you need more for justification. Yeah, so that's different than arguing that the Christian worldview as a whole, which includes all of these things, is the solution to the
that makes sense. Analogy would be, I have a Swiss Army knife of epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, morality, or whatever, and I have it because it's useful, right? that's a normal approach. You just ad hoc take it. But a Christian worldview is saying not only is any other view can't justify the Swiss Army knife. We're going to tell you how it is you have the Swiss Army knife altogether that you're using. Not an argument that you have it because you're using it. That's not a real position, right? Okay, that's like Matt Dillahunty. Well, we use logic because we have it. It's like, well, no, you're just taking the tool that you have. We're asking for, and this is the thing you always sigh about, which is people constantly conflate an assertion with a justification. That asserting something that sounds right, you might even agree with the assertion. It's not the same as a justification, right?
And this is even stronger a level beyond that, because this is actually saying not so much against the atheist, but against a foundationalist who would say, like Tim Gordon would say, well, look, law of identity, A equals A, I mean, through retorsion or through a reductio, if you deny it, you can't have knowledge at all. That's true, but that doesn't tell me that the principle itself is true, because Father Deacon has a paper where he argues along these lines, and he says, well, take the case of a schizophrenic. In the case of a schizophrenic's mind, it might be, to him, it might seem like all this craziness makes sense, right? Like all the voices in his head, all the weird stuff. For him, it's this coherent worldview that the government is persecuting him, right? And so everything makes sense, right? But it's not true in the external world. So the schizophrenic is an example of why and we're not saying schizophrenic is true. It's just a counterexample that shows that seeming coherence in a mental schema is not enough. You need the entire worldview.
What do you say to this one? So ironic, because the first Christians would have drug you both into the streets for being philosophers. Well, they didn't deny philosophy. They denied vain philosophy, and not all philosophy. Yeah, I mean, you couldn't actually. I mean, it's just a silly position.
That's silly. Like St. Justin Martyr is called Justin the Philosopher.
Yeah, I mean, philosophy, you can't really engage with any of the truth of the matter. You just think philosophy is a gross word, right? This is a view that probably a Protestant, probably someone who's saying, oh, I read philosophy in the Bible and it says warning against it, therefore all philosophy.
I mean, the book of Ecclesiastes is a book of philosophy.
Lazy. Yeah. By the way, did during the all of the seven councils and before, was philosophy not necessary to debate and fight off heresies using consistency and logic and why things need to be accounted for, using our God-given faculties called the logic, heart, nous, mind, rationality? Of course. I mean, this is silly.
It's vain philosophy that's rejected, not philosophy.
Vain philosophy.
My logic tutor in first year used to say that a good way to get your head around this intuitively is, well, if this is true, then anything can be true.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I've been planning on doing a video about this concept, from the false ex falso quod.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I'm gonna actually skip to consciousness here.
Not being a materialist.
Yes, I mean this is almost like the kind of runs like that would apply to logic one. Indeed, loads of ones.
You can believe that consciousness is this strange immaterial. You could believe in the existence of the soul.
Okay, I wanted to. You weren't here for this, Jay. He was in the early part of this video. He was saying that there are atheists who are materialists, or materialists who are atheists, but there are people who are atheists who reject materialism. I'm saying, okay, fine. People can try to hold the view. I've come to the conclusion that I'm not. They can claim that, but I'm not certain how an atheist is not going to be whittled down into some sort of materialism or physicalism, just like New Agers, right? They use all of these metaphysical terms like spirit and mind and all these things, but when you press them on them, a New Age or a spiritual, not religious person, you push them and they end up folding down into like energy and frequencies and all of these things. Now, is it possible, because Alex has taken the position, well, all materialists are atheists, but not all atheists are materialists? Now, is that just kind of like you go, okay, yeah, they can hold.
I mean, there are in the minority, atheist philosophers and academics who are not strict materialists. There are some.
But are they consistent as opposed to they just hold the position? Okay, that's what I'm saying. Is like that's a question. It's like, are they really, when pressed? I think the answer is no. Do they hold the position? Fine. Yeah.
Like you could be a Platonist atheist, and you could be a transcendental idealist atheist, and like you could conceivably, for example, think that all of reality is pure idea, like Berkeley did, and just not believe in a deity. I suppose. But I mean, that's like very rare positions, like maybe 1 in 1,000 professors has that position.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's why I ask, like, well, someone could post the position up, and if we start kicking at it, it seems like they would have no place to go than to reduce things to empirical things and matter and physicalism if they're questioned. Unless they just go, listen, I just take this weird unjustified Platonic view that there's things out there that aren't identical to matter, and somehow we have access.
Well, they could just they could just be Berkeleyan idealists or Platonist idealists, and they could just simply deny matter. They could just say what you think is matter is just ideas, and there is no God. There's just ideas. So. Right. What exactly ideas are would just be, something immaterial, invariant, or something like that. But again, that's a very few people. I mean, there are philosophers who would think that.
Yeah, but then they're basically halfway into solipsism, and at that point, because then you just ask, well, whose ideas are the proper assessment of the external world, and then like. It's this battle of like one person's set of ideas versus another person. But then that person has to be beyond an idea. Like if the objects in the world are just ideas, then the people in the world are just ideas. So then, I don't see how they can escape a solipsistic view. But
well, I mean, they might think that there's many ideas and many minds. So all that exists is mind. Matter is illusory. There's many minds and many ideas, and then what we call matter is just what we think is going on with molecules, when really it's all just ideas as they're presented to us.
Yeah,
so
I get
there's actually a reason why they might think this, though, and this has to do with there's an Enlightenment dispute. I don't want to get too far afield. You probably don't want to talk about this, but
it's okay.
It has to do with what's called direct and indirect realism. And so like John Locke and people like that at the time of the Enlightenment, they were debating whether or not I'm actually sensing solidity when I touch a thing, or whether solidity is something that's presented in my mind. And they had a really hard time. If you're an empiricist, they had a hard time with this, because people like David Hume, well, obviously there's an external world, and these are just sensations imprinted upon my camcorder mind. Mm-hmm. But other Enlightenment philosophers said, well, now, wait a minute, that's an unjustified assumption. Maybe the sensations are in the mind, and everything that's happening is in the mind. And in other words, they can just deny the external world assumption and say that there is no external world. There's just a commonly experienced mind world.
Right. That leads to, would you say that leads to?
I think I think you could go towards solipsism.
Yeah. Or panpsychism. I don't understand how you could be a panpsychic and then also make some sort of distinctions between.
I think the problem with that position is that they have to end up like having a bunch of metaphysical assumptions that are very contrary to kind of common sense reality. So it's sort of like everything that you think is going on isn't going on. And then it's like, okay, well, if that's the case, then why should I assume this metaphysical assumption of there being many minds and there's like a giant mind? And it's just sort of a lot of leaps.
Yeah. Well, also what you said before, if there are these people you said during that phase of philosophy who were saying, well, there's just ideas out there, and then the sense input, if the sense input had nothing to do with being dependent on an actual object, then you wouldn't need the external world to perceive what we call the external world. There would just be like this sense input coming from wherever. It didn't need to be an object. So what is sense input? What is input if it's not separate from the thing that's doing the interpretation?
Well, Berkeley would just say, for example, that what you're sensing is just another idea. So he's not saying it's all. He's saying that there are sensory inputs, but the sensory inputs are ideas from other ideas.
So this is the basis, is this the basis for the simulacrum, which became the famous movie? You think this view, or is it before that? Like, it seems like if that was the first like basement people being like, bro, like what if we're just playing a mind game?
That's probably more so like from Plato, and the difference is that Berkeley is an empiricist, and so Plato's not a big. I mean, Plato believes that knowledge comes from sense data, but it's like the lowest level of knowledge. So they have a huge difference on where we get knowledge. But Berkeley is he's just as much an empiricist as Locke or David Hume. The only difference is that he's saying, David Hume, you're inconsistent by assuming an external world. You have no justification for that. I'm going to be the most consistent empiricist and say that all reality is ideas, because didn't we just see in these Enlightenment disputes that you can't really justify the difference between the sensation and the object?
Wait, so you're saying even though famously Hume is the most consistent, there was another guy who was even more consistent?
Well, just on that one point of external world. Okay. So he's basically saying, and by the way, Berkeley, because he was an Anglican clergyman, or Irish Anglican clergyman, he wanted to defend theism against Hume and the skepticism. And he thought a way to do this would be to say, well, maybe all knowledge does come from sense data, but the mistake is to think that it's corpuscles or corpuscularianism, from what Descartes talked about, that everything is just little atoms bouncing around, right? He says, rather than thinking of it as a bunch of material atoms, all you're ever sensing is literally ideas, because all that exists is ideas.
Interesting. But then again, that would mean that to do induction, you're actually interacting with a set of particular ideas that aren't identical to the previous ones in every moment.
Right, but
every
Berkeley,
moment would be a new
Berkeley
idea.
As a theist would say, yeah, but in my case, I don't have a problem with there being universals and particulars. There's one ultimate idea who's God. That's the big idea.
Yeah, I gotcha. You ever get something as silly as this in your chat? The transcendental argument for evolution, that's funny, is how you can be a non-materialist atheist. I'm sorry, but evolution is a materialist paradigm, right? So what is this non-materialism you get from evolution? By the way, evolution can't even tell you how information, being immaterial and not identical to matter, exists, and yet evolution requires the transfer of evolution. Becky? Thank you, Becky. Do you want to respond to that goofiness?
Well, again, it's really misunderstanding the function of the transcendental argument. It's not an argument to give you an indirect basis for anything. It's in our case, it's an indirect argument to give you a basis for the entire Christian worldview. So it wouldn't make sense to say that it proves an immaterial process that somehow gives rise to a material process that somehow gives rise to immateriality. There's no way that an abstract transcendental argument could actually justify that. It would just be assuming what's supposed to be proven by that. That's why it's a comparison of worldviews. It's not like this transcendental category proves that matter gives rise to immateriality.
Yeah. By the way, these transcendental things would be mind dependent and can't be identical to a physical process called evolution anyway.
Right.
So it's like to even post-diction summarize evolution, you're appealing to things that are not found in the process of evolution. So, I mean...
And also, this sounds like emergentism, which is an argument against materialism. So,
right, yeah.
If matter gives rise to consciousness and immateriality, that would be a refutation of materialism, and that would mean that evolution ultimately isn't true.
Right. Most people don't realize that. I talked to Father Deacon Ananias about that, how most people don't, when they say emergent property, the mind's emergent, they really think that the material reality can produce and percolate something that's not identical to the machine that's doing it, like steam over the pot of water or something. And like you just said, it's most people who use emergent property as a term, they don't realize that emergentism, the school of thinking, refutes the thing they're trying to argue using emergent properties.
And by the way, if they're allowed to make that leap as a Dillahunty person is misusing that argument, then what's wrong with me saying, okay, then there's immaterial things like angels, souls, and God?
Sure. Yeah. That's one of my favorite angles, is that I'll just take an ordinary atheist who says, God doesn't exist, I have no reason to believe in God because XYZ, empiricism, evidentialism missing. And I go, oh, that's interesting. I'll just list the categories of things that they assume without evidence. This doesn't prove that all claims of things that are immaterial exist. It just shows that their standard they use to negate God's existence are a bunch of things the very standard they're using is an immaterial standard that's not verified through empirical data. It's like
exactly. Well, think back to the great paper, The Two Dogmas of Empiricism by Quine. He ends the paper by saying that anytime somebody in the empiricist atheist tradition tries to predication itself is the equivalent of the ancient Greek gods. Meaning is the equivalent of the ancient Greek gods and the flying spaghetti monster.
Wow. So this stuff, would you say the criticisms of all of this stuff and the fact that this stuff percolates back up into culture is the result of the Enlightenment itself, because they just got lax on their rigor? They just granted a bunch of things and people ran rampant? Because didn't the Enlightenment, correct me if I'm wrong, just say, well, let's take a self-evident axiomatic approach to all these fundamental things, and we don't have to justify the fundamental things. We just kind of accept them. And now, if you just accept those things, why would we be surprised at a resurgence of all this insane stuff you and I critique and laugh at on, popping out of TikTok and all these?
Well, yeah, exactly. You're right. Enlightenment is critique, right? It's basically saying, let's take the laws of logic, these self-evident axioms and principles, and let's critique the metaphysics of Christianity, the ancient world, and the Middle Ages. And what we see when we do that is we basically hack off everything metaphysical. But then the next generation says, wait a minute, if we're going to be consistent, and we're going to hack off the metaphysics and the things that we can't justify, we're going to start hacking off and getting rid of the things that the Enlightenment's using.
Our mind.
Everything the Enlightenment is assuming is going to get hacked away too. Laws of logic, external world, identity over time, the self, the mind, meaning.
Yeah.
And so as they hack away, you get the end result of basically Quine saying, nobody in the empiricist, materialist, atheist tradition in 500 years has given a sufficient answer to David Hume. And basically all that's happened is that everything has become psychology. So epistemology becomes psychologized.
That makes sense.
We're still there, he says. We're never going to get out of this box.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're taking their approach altogether is backwards, like using, instead of asking, what's the ultimate start point for all of this being possible? They go, well, what endpoint can we get to using our faculties? And it's like, well, no, the question is, how did you get your faculties to begin with? How is it the case that you can even reason to a conclusion, not, the other way around? And hence, I believe that would be the basis for pursuing the tag argument in general, because you're not granting them all of the things that are required for them to come to conclusions. You're asking a bigger question. I guess you would call that a metalogical question is, well, no, let's ask a bigger question that the Enlightenment people just didn't want to deal with. Or was it that they didn't want to deal with it in your estimation? Or it's just kind of culture. It just kind of happened that way. Like,
yeah, I think men are limited by their times, and we can't expect, people in the Middle Ages, we can't expect them to necessarily ask the questions of the 1800s. Because a lot of things have to happen, a lot of questions of people kind of creatively saying, hey, wait a minute, what about this? Like, we've assumed this, we haven't asked this. Because remember, let's take linguistic philosophy, for example. There's some linguistic philosophy in the ancient world, people asking questions about signs and symbols. There's a little bit in the Middle Ages, maybe a little more. And it doesn't really get questioned until the 1700s. So it's the first modern linguistic philosopher is Jean-Baptiste Vico, and he's pretty late, like early 1700s. So people hadn't even thought to question the propositions at length. Again, some people had questioned these things, and they raised issues in the Middle Ages, but to really drill into even linguistic philosophy is pretty late. So we can't assume that, we might think, well, why didn't they just ask the questions we're asking? Well, humans operate a lot of times with assumptions, and they don't oftentimes question their assumptions.
Yeah. Well, someone recently asked me, hey, JimBob, you're doing a lot of talk about evolution. Why is it the case that people in this field haven't brought up your contentions and the contentions of your associates and peers? And I'm like, well, this assumption that if something's false, the presentation of how it's false is going to be adequately accepted in the time frame that the paradigm's delivered. We're still very new, by the way, in the infancy, right?
This is the point of Thomas Kuhn's Structures of Scientific Revolution. That famous book that won an award because the whole thesis of the book is that new paradigms are not accepted immediately at that time on the basis of pure reasoning and demonstration and proof. In fact, when challenges to paradigms are put forward, the tendency for human nature is to cling even more intensely to the existing paradigm before they concede to the new paradigm.
Yeah, it's interesting. And by the way, if we get to a point where, you know, natural selection and all the rest is adequately offset by something new, the people who believed in all that dogmatically are just going to move over to their authority anyway and say, well, it was our authority who debunked it. You know?
Exactly. Well, notice that there's a pattern there between, I mean, they're talking about two different topics, but Quine's two dogmas of empiricism, right? He's pointing out that empiricism was intended to get rid of dogmas of metaphysics. And yet empiricists in their extreme reach, like people like, what does he say, Popper, Carnap and others, like they've gotten to this point, Carnap, I think, they've in the strict positivists have gotten to this point where they think that they don't have any dogmas, but they've still got two dogmas. And then it's the same point with Kuhn's book. People think that in the realm of science, they operate on pure facts and art and logic and objectivity, but rather the opposite is true, and they treat it like a religion.
Which is why, you know, even in my own chat, the impulse is to have this negative aversion, you know, to dogma, and we go, no, you can't escape dogma in general. The term, it's just that you gotta isolate, you know, when it's incoherent or limited or something, like, because we wouldn't just say dogma, ick, yucky. People think that that's just what you should do. You just go dogma, icky, yucky. Well, obviously in Christianity, we don't say dogma, icky, yucky. But in their tradition, in that world, they think they're purely skeptical. They really think there's a purity to skepticism, but that is a dogma in itself that has its own dogma to it.
It's a total worldview. In fact, I mean, the famous skeptics and Skeptic magazine, like Michael Shermer and those characters, like they notoriously never deviate from the establishment teachings, dogmas, and positions on everything. So whether it's the Big Nine event or whether it's GMOs, stabbies, like they literally go across the line for the which it's not very skeptical to me if you're basically in line with whatever basically the State Department and the establishment says. How is that skepticism?
Yeah, it's not skeptical at all. But you know, they get their touring badges, I guess, from that anyway. So. Let's move along with this and see if they take us anywhere.
Oh, you can believe in all of that kind of stuff and just not believe in like an agential God overseeing it all. It would be quite weird.
Agential?
It would still be like weirder that there wasn't some like creation.
I don't think that's a word. I think he's making up words. I mean, I could be wrong.
Is that something not tangential?
Agential? No, like an agent. Like a God that's not an intentional agent, but he said agential. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's the word.
I'll make it popular.
I've never heard of it.
Of that persuasion. So it's worth noting that. But I think really the question here, put in the context of atheists not being able to answer it, is like consciousness.
Okay, I'm wrong. It is a word.
Strange thing to expect.
I'm refuted. Cosmic skeptic refuted me. I'm out.
Referring to having agency, thinking mind.
Okay. I got to retire. He refuted me.
Yeah, it's over.
If there is no
they're going to bring this up forever.
Universe, and if there is no immaterial element to the universe, because consciousness seems like it's immaterial. It seems, I mean, we can answer this as if we were looking for questions that materialists can't answer.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Consciousness is very strange. I've talked about it a lot recently. People who've been listening to my recent material will know that I'm just bemused by consciousness.
Well, it's one of the weirdest things. You know, as in, it's a bit like the laws of logic in the sense that it's one of the weirdest things and one of the most obvious things. Yeah. What are you going to do to I think it's Paul Churchland is a limited materialist, so he thinks that consciousness doesn't exist, and he thinks about it. That's more nuanced than that. Position. But I remember reading one of his papers and being like, "What do you mean? How do I even go about disbelieving in consciousness?
This seems like a
it's like, how do you expect?
This is another thing. There are two separate questions, Jay, is what is consciousness, and are you able to coherently reject consciousness as the way you know it to be? Like, even if you posited a non-exhaustive definition of consciousness, the act of denying it would be utilizing the thing that you're denying, so it'd be absurd. But this isn't a justification for consciousness or what it is. This is just assuming, well, whatever it is that I describe, by just simply being able to observe and evaluate things or have some sort of like interaction with the external world or whatever, that doesn't tell me how it came to be, what it is specifically. So they're close to, I think he's close to saying, well, denying it, it's going to, you know, again, we went over this. The fact that you can't deny something exists would be different than giving a justification for how and why it exists, right? In this case. You know,
yeah,
say,
I
like,
mean,
well, we have it. Yeah.
I think typically atheists make that mistake. They're going to start trying to talk about where they think it came from as if that justifies it or if that gives an account for it, which it doesn't.
Yeah.
It's just telling a story. But what is it? I mean, in the Orthodox view, it's I guess the energy of the soul's awareness of what's going on in the world and in terms of the beings of the world. So I think we would have an energetic description of it.
Would that be distinct,
energy of the mind?
Jay, from the nous, the sort of conjunction of the mind-heart interaction with the metaphysical? Would consciousness be something not identical to the apparatus that engages with consciousness? Okay.
Yeah, the nous is the heart. So basically, you know, the mind's up here, heart's over here. So the fathers always say that the mind, there's nothing wrong with the intellect and the mind, but it's a limited thing. It has to be put into or moved into the heart, meaning it has to work in union with the heart faculty. And until we are repentant and in relationship with God, our heart faculty is out of whack. And so we're going to think that, like all the atheists do, that pure mind can explain the world. The irony, of course, being that in their denial of God, they are also denying the existence of immaterial things like mind. So they end up denying themselves.
Yeah, that they exist. You know, I don't exist. That's interesting because I thought about this, how we, from a Christian view, we say something like morality is written on our heart. That would be pointing to the nous, that something is not reduced to intellect, but uses intellect. It wouldn't deny the intellect. But then I thought, well, is there a similar statement? And you tell me from a Christian view, Orthodox specifically, is that the way in which morality is written on our heart, do we have it written on our heart to want to know the truth? Or is that a brain, would that be reduced to like the intellect wanting to know the truth?
I think the way that fathers describe it is that, and they're not coming from a philosophy view on this. They actually, it's actually rooted in the Hebrew prophets, because you'll read like David talks about his heart. You know, Paul says the word is near you, even in your heart. Which is not to say that God is not connected to the mind, but that fallen man has the tendency to worship and only go with his intellect and his mind, which is a limited faculty. It's good. It has a lot of uses, but it can't become a God. And for all the atheists, it's their God. And then again, ironically, they turn around and deny their God. But the best essay on this is St. Justin Popovich's essay on the doctrine of knowledge of St. Isaac the Syrian. It's in his book, Life in Christ by Justin Popovich. And he explains in there that I think ideally what is supposed to happen is that man's mind is basically in his heart. And so that means that through repentance and through relationship with God, I can then correctly interpret the world through my heart, which is seeing it through the eyes of God, right? And seeing that I can see the world correctly. Whereas when the heart and the mind are divided, I see the world in this bare, cold, intellectual way, which actually ends up destroying the intellect.
Gotcha. And then holding that view doesn't clear the windshield, so to speak. That from our view, the praxis, the going to divine liturgy, the practice of clearing the heart, clearing the soul, like a hospital.
That's a great analogy.
It's not like you just go, well, I hold this view, therefore it's like I'm
not.
No,
it's
fogged,
like exactly. Right? It's an acquiring of the virtues. In other words, this is that point we always have to come back to. Like, you can't divorce epistemology from ethics, because as Wood points out, W.J. Wood in that book, he points out that, like, well, wouldn't we think that the realm of intellect and reasoning, like, wouldn't we want people to be intellectually honest? So in other words, obviously you can't divorce epistemology from virtues. So in the same way, like, if I'm going to interpret the world correctly, am I going to be able to interpret it correctly if I am enmeshed in all the vices and I don't care about virtue? No, of course not. I'm going to lie about the world. I'm going to lie about what I think.
Yeah. That's what fascinates me about the scripture, the fool in his heart, rejects God, essentially, because it's not that they're using just their intellect. in their rebellion of God. Because coming to the conclusion like, oh, God doesn't exist, if it was just purely intellect, it's not like the emotional aspect of rebellion of that, or let's say counter apologetics is based in just the mind. I find not that I'm trying to fully interpret that myself, here. It's just that I just find it interesting that the select word used is the fool in his heart, not in his mind, in his intellect. The fool in his heart has this engagement with rebellion, which means he's actually engaging in something that his intellect can't justify, which is this like urge to deny or fight. That's not an intellectual process necessarily.
Exactly. And this is a huge difference between East and West. I mean, the entire Roman Catholic tradition after Augustine equates the soul with the mind or the intellect. And so that's why it's another reason why they think natural theology is true. It's another reason why they think that, well, if I just present the evidences, you'll believe, right? They're missing the whole point that, like, you can't interpret even the natural world correctly without repentance.
Right, because the intellect would be some sort of added tool we're given to point to God or to find, in a sense, but it doesn't fully get us there. But the intellect doesn't give you the heart that to give you the sense of why it is to even use the intellect. Like the intellect doesn't give you the reason.
It's like the difference. Yeah, it's like the difference between me listing all the facts about my wife versus the actual relationship we have. Right. The facts aren't wrong. They're not bad.
Yeah.
But it's not the relationship.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. It's not like our loved ones are like Magic the Gathering, or baseball cards would be more appropriate, and they have a list of attributes, and then you're like, I want to be with my wife, and you're just looking like at a baseball card of your wife. It's like, no, that's not the participation that
my wife is a pog, and I throw down the pogs that I want.
Yeah, totally. You're like you're downloading info and facts, and you just read them over and over. My wife is beautiful. My wife is beautiful. That's fun.
Yeah, that was a great analogy that FDA had between, like, imagine thinking that this is all like a rational contract or like a letter, right? Rather than like the relationship you have with your wife, right? So if somebody read a letter about me, would they know me in a limited sense? Yeah, I know about Jay. I read that letter that described what he's like. But that doesn't mean they know me.
Right. Yeah, that's also gets into our energies versus our nature and our essence, is that when we engage with each other, we're engaging with energies, and they're not reducible to a list in an essay, right? Like, so there are these things, and again, even energies might even be like limited analogy, right? Because we have the words that we have, right? Someone might press and be like, well, energy refers to like a force, something you can like physically manipulate. Well, I guess what do we say?
Well, no, it's not just physical. That's why, like we were talking about with Maximus and other Orthodox saints and theologians, like the energy of the mind. So when you talk to me, there's an energy, a mental energy that's happening here that's not equated to. It has a relationship to the neurons firing, but it can't be reduced and equated to physical energy, like you're saying.
Right. Because intent and like you could say activity, someone might take a mechanical approach, but intent, you can't isolate the intent, right?
Great point. I think that intent would come from your innermost being, your innermost desires, which is not reducible to your mind. Like, your mind is not identical to your intentionality or your love, right? Love, your love for your wife relates to your mind, and it manifests in thoughts about it, but it's not reducible to or identical to your thoughts about your wife, thoughts about love. It comes from your innermost being.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. People were bringing up the relational argument for, like, say, the Trinity, which we don't have to get into in depth, but it is interesting how once you point to these things out, how even our engagement with, let's say, love, the act of loving, is this participation between persons. There's an activity, and if it wasn't that, you would just be able to participate in your own head and say you loved your wife. You just be, if Islam was true, for instance, or Unitarian Christianity, quote, Christianity would be true, you could just love just in your brain, and you'd be doing the virtue of love. You'd be just doing the practice of love. It would just be an internal exercise with engaging with the self-projection of the thing you say love is, or the subject of who you're loving. And if you did it internally, it would be sufficient. Because
well, I mean, this is what we say about all Western deviations, and even you could include Islam and Protestantism as well, because we would typically say they're worshiping their idea.
Yeah,
their idea of God.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. By the way, did you want to talk about that really quick? Because I know I sent you his silly stuff, and it's like I don't even expect you to give it a wink, but the argument is this, Jay. Premise 1, everything that we observe to exist comes from previous stuff. Arises, right? Okay. Premise 2, the universe exists. Conclusion, the universe arises from previous stuff. Now, I went 3 different angles to completely destroy this. What is the main one you would have gone right away from this?
Well, right away, it reminds me of what we were talking about when I first came in today with you, which was, well, this seems to be making kind of a almost universal claim about states of affairs. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you have any access to or knowledge of that. Stuff arises. That's a good one. So this sounds like a universal law. Like
he says inductive. He says induction. He said, Jay, I'm using an inductive argument. Right? That's what he says. I'm using induction. Right?
But induction can never get you to a universal state of affairs.
Right, and he said he would say
it's not law-like, if that's the case.
No, he would say he's not making an argument of certainty or universal claims about states of affairs, but you have to, because to say there's a past, you're not using induction to come to the conclusion of the regularity of the past. You have to assume that, right? That these things.
So, in other words, he's basically saying, to reduce this to absurdity, he's just saying that the stuff that I've ever observed comes from other stuff, which is basically to say not much at all.
It doesn't. Actually, I did a swap out of his argument. If his argument is everything we see today, quote, stuff, right? Because that would be stuff, arises from stuff. Okay, stuff arises from stuff, premise 1. The universe exists. Well, what's the universe? Stuff. Stuff exists. That's pretty much the translation. The conclusion is stuff arises from stuff. So, he's positing something as an inductive argument when really it's just a circular argument that starts with the
I was going to say, you could also critique it as really a meaningless statement.
It is. It's just gibberish.
Yeah. So it's like saying everything comes from something, and then that produces more things.
For stuff, yeah.
But what does that tell us about the world? Nothing.
It tells us nothing, which is why it's like a parody, Parity of, I think, the Kalam. This is where he's run off with this. These sort of components that go back in time and have this initial cause or whatever. Stuff comes from stuff. But again, another critique I had, Jay, was stuff arising from stuff.
Arising as a process.
You
could just run through everything that Hume raises as a major issue and critique any position like that. Like, okay, how do you know that the stuff that you're using as a mental conceptual thing, mm-hmm. and then you're saying there's a causal relationship of it producing or causing more stuff. How do you know that there's this stuff in the external world, and how do you know that there's actually causation in the external world because you haven't observed that?
So he says circular arguments and tautologies are only allowed. No, we accept tautologies of language. We would accept using logic, but the justification is what we're really asking for. So, like, even if we granted you some sort of like linguistic circularity, like, a tree is a tree, we know what we're referring to, we'll allow it or whatever. I would disagree with this, that for when a Christian does a circular argument, right? Well, we would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, here, is that if you posit God, if you posit any ultimate necessary grounding for all things, I don't think you can get away with what you're calling circular or ultimacy, like some ultimacy that you have to appeal to eventually. So you're just saying circularity wrong, but why? Why circularity wrong? Do you want to respond to that?
Missing the point that, like, as FDA was saying the other day, I mean, if you're talking about in normal day-to-day conversations about this or that thing, true or false, mm-hmm. you can't commit a circular argument. But when you're talking about the final court of appeal for anybody's worldview or their starting mm-hmm. point, everybody will have a self-referencing, self-authenticating, recursive starting mm-hmm. point. And we're saying that that's true for everybody.
Right.
And the only other option, if you don't believe that, is to posit some kind of self-evidence, which is very easy to refute, to show that, no, actually you are believing in some kind of self-referencing recursive thing. And that's the whole point when we talk about Gödel incompleteness theorems or the limitations of any system. They ultimately they become self-referencing. So we're saying that's true for everybody: atheist, materialist, Christian. They're all self-referencing worldviews because it's inescapable. So we're not saying that we are allowed to have fallacies and atheists aren't.
Right. Yeah, because the fallacy is actually referencing a particular kind of system of logic where you reject fallacy, a circularity. Like, well, Emmanuel says not all circularity ends up being viciously, quote, viciously or whatever, but that gets into a newer debate.
So, yeah, fallacies are not allowed at the normal level of logic and argumentation. Yeah. But when you ask meta-logical questions about how does logic itself work, what's the logic of logic, then everyone will be forced into some sort of self-referencing recursive position. That's the point.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, by the way, the guy who just said that, I had a little exchange with him on this channel and on the X Space, and he said he couldn't be sure he's not an apple. So I mean, you know, I usually start with, are you to what extent you're certain you're not an apple, and then we can get into the circularity of Christianity. Cool. Well, everybody who's listening, go follow Jay Dyer